welcome to chapter 6 of the Spring tutorial for beginners. So in chapter 5 we saw the various ways in which we can inject dependencies in Spring, and in this chapter we're going to take a look at some of the important Spring core annotations and see examples of each of them. So the first one is Hotwire, and it says used to inject a dependency of a particular type into a variable. So we have already seen how this annotation works in our previous chapters, but we're gonna see it again in this chapter. So it says used to inject a dependency of a particular type into a variable. So let's see how it works. And for the demo, I've already created a project named string demo, and let's take a look at the dependencies inside the form. So we have Spring Boot starter and Spring Boot starter test, and that would add the Spring core dependencies to this project, and nothing else other than that. And we have the main class the main method here inside this class Spring demo application, and this is basically the entry point for our application. So let's first create an interface, and I'm going to name this person. Click on finish, and then I'm going to create two classes that implement this interface. So I'm going to name the first one as student and add an interface called person, right? And I'm going to create another class and name it, say, teacher, right? And add an interface called person. Click on finish, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to generate, go to source and generate the toString method, and click on OK. And here I'm going to return student from this class, and I'm going to copy this, paste it inside teacher, and return teacher from here, right? Okay, so let's take a look at how Hotwire works, right? So for that, I'm going to create a class. All right, let's just use this class. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say @Hotwire, and let's have private person, right? Now I'm going to get the imports, and then I'm going to say @bean, and I'm going to say public void test, right? Get the imports, and I'm going to say print person is plus person, right? And there's one more thing I'm going to do. I'm going to say @bean public person, say create person bean, right? And I'm going to say return new student, right? And let's try to run this application and see how it works. So I'm going to say Spring Boot app, click on OK. So we get this message person is student, and what we just did is we injected a type of person into this variable called person with the help of the annotation Hotwire, right? So what we are trying to do is we are trying to inject a type which is person into this variable called person using the annotation Hotwire. And since there is only one bean of the type person which belongs to the student class, or which is an object of student class, this person is injected with this bean, right? Now what if we return a teacher from here? Let's try this and let's run our application again. So this time we have the person as a teacher, right? So because a teacher bean is getting injected into this variable, which is a person type, right? So that is how Hotwire works. And now let's take a look at the next annotation. So the next one is @component, and it says used to specify string to register a bean of the class. So here what I did was I created a bean manually. So instead of doing this, I'll just remove this. I could have also created a bean of this class by using @component. So when we have this annotation @component, it tells Spring to create a bean of this class at the time when the application context is initialized, right? So let's try to run this again. Let's see what happens. So this time the person is student, and if we remove the component annotation from here, get rid of the unused imports and paste the component here, right, and try to run the application again, we have teacher injected into person, right? Into the variable called person, right? So that is how we can use component to create beans of a class, or rather tell Spring to create a bean of a class when the application context is loaded, right? So next up we have bean. We have already used this annotation. We are going to use it again. We are going to see a demo for it again. So what does it say? Used to manually create a bean of a class for which the source code is not accessible and the class is not already inside the Spring container. Now when we mark a class as @component, we put it inside the Spring container, but this class is not inside the Spring container because it doesn't have @component annotated on top of it, right? But what if we did not have access to these classes? Suppose these classes are added into our project as jars inside the build path of our project, and we did not have access to the source code of these classes. So there's no way we could have marked these classes as component, and we still wanted to bring these classes inside the Spring container, or we want to create beans of these classes. We could have done it using @bean and written a method, a public method, which returns a type of person, and we could have named it, say, create student bean, or rather create person bean, right? And this method would return an object of person type. So we could have returned new student, or we could have returned new teacher, right? Either of them. And if we run this, we see a bean is getting created which is of type student, and if we would have replaced this with teacher, we would have gotten a bean of teacher type, right? So we have the person as teacher. So that is how @bean works, right? And next up we have @qualifier. So it says used to specify the name of a bean for dependency injection when more than one bean qualifies for dependency injection. Control DI at client end. So what does that exactly mean? So let's suppose we remove this, right? And let's suppose we have these classes marked as components. So I would just write component on top of this, and I'd copy this and paste it on top of teacher. So at this point of time we have two classes, or we have we have two classes which are of the type person. So both of these classes implement person, and they are included inside the Spring container, and they have beans of themselves created inside the application context by Spring, right? Because we have marked both the classes as component. And in this class what we are trying to do is we are trying to inject a bean which is of type person into this variable. But there are two beans, namely student and teacher, which are of type person. So let's see what happens when we run this application. So we get an error, and our application fails to start, and the description is fill person in com.demo.spring demo application required a single bean but two were found, student and teacher. So Spring doesn't know which bean it has to inject into person, right? So what we could have done is we could have specified which bean we want to be injected if there are more than one beans that qualify to be injected into this variable, right? So with the help of qualifier annotation we could have done that, and inside this I would have mentioned the name of the bean. So let's say student. So what I'm telling Spring is if there are more than one beans that qualify to be injected into this variable called person, which is of type person, then inject the bean which has the name student, right? Now let's try to run this and see how it works. So this time we have student injected into person, right? If I change this to teacher, we should be having teacher injected into person. Yeah, that is exactly what happens. This time the person is teacher, right? So that is how we can specify the name of a bean for dependency injection when more than one beans qualify for dependency injection, right? Now the fifth annotation is primary, @primary. So what does it do? It is used to specify object of a particular type or a particular class as a primary choice for dependency injection when more than one bean qualifies for dependency injection. Control dependency injection at service provider end. @qualifier is given high preference when both @primary and @qualifier are present. So instead of doing @qualifier, what we also could have done is we could have marked one of these classes as primary, or one of these beans as primary, right? So with the help of primary annotation, what we're trying to do is we're trying to tell Spring that if there are more than one beans which are of the same type, that is person, then this bean which is of type student should be injected into the variable into which we are trying to do a dependency injection, right? So let's run this and see how it works. So we have the student object or the student being injected into person, right? Now let's remove this from here, right? And let's paste it inside teacher and try to run the application again. So this time the person is teacher, right? Now what if we had qualifier as well? So our primary bean is teacher, and let's say we annotate this with qualifier as say student. Let's see what happens. So qualifier also does the same work as primary. What primary does is it is basically a way of telling Spring that if there are more than one beans of a particular type that qualify to be injected for dependency injection, then use the one which has primary annotated on top of it, right? And qualifier is also used to do the same thing, that if there are more than one beans that qualify to be injected into a particular type, then use the bean that is specified inside the qualifier as the bean to be injected into the variable or into the type, right? Now let's try to run this. So our qualifier is student and our primary bean is teacher, and let's try to run this and see what happens. So person is student and student bean gets injected into person. So we can see qualifier is given precedence or preference over teacher or over primary, right? So if we have both primary and qualifier annotations present, Spring would inject the bean that is specified inside qualifier, right? And it would not take into account the primary bean. So qualifier is a way of injecting or specifying the bean which we want to inject at the client side, and at the red primary is a way of specifying or telling Spring which bean should be injected if there are multiple beans that qualify to be injected at the service provider side, right? Now let's take a look at the next one. So the next one is at the red value, and it says used to inject value into a variable. It may also be injected from an external property source such as application.properties file. All right, so let's just remove this. Okay, so let's just remove this. Sorry, move this and say this is a string, say application name, right? And just get rid of this as well, and let's say application name is application name, right? And let's say we have an annotation here called value, the red value, right? And inside this, let's say Spring boot demo application, right? And let's run this. So we can see we have this message printed here which says application name is Spring Boot demo application, right? So what we just did is we injected this value into this variable using at the red value, right? And we can see when we try to print this variable or this string variable, we have this value getting printed because this variable is holding this value, right? What we could have also done is instead of writing it here, we could have just Control X, remove this and put it inside application.properties. So I would say application dot, let's say string.application.name equals, right? And I'll just copy this and let's say dollar, sorry, dollar and curly braces, and then put the key for the property, right? and let's see what happens when we run this. So we can see we still have the same result, and this time the property or the value is being read from a properties file, which is an external file, right? So for reading an external properties file, we did not need to write any kind of code. We did not need to write any kind of input stream or any kind of buffer reader which reads from an external file. All we did is use this annotation @value. So this is how we can use @value to inject values into a variable without having to write boilerplate code, right? So that is basically how @value works. And next up we have @depends on, and it says used to specify the order of bean creation. The bean on which a particular bean depends on would be created first. So we can also control the order in which the beans are created, right? So I'll just get rid of this. I'll get rid of I'll just keep this and remove this statement. Let's call this test1, and let's print test1 from this, right? And let's have another bean, and let's print test2 from this and name it test2, right? Now let's try to run this. Get rid of first I'll get rid of the unused imports, and I'll try to run this application. Okay, so first we have test1 printed, and then we have test2 printed. Now what if we want to control the order in which the beans are created, or the order in which string creates the beans? We can do that with the help of this annotation called depends on, and I would say test2, right? And I'd run this again. So this now we have test1 and test2, right? Test1 printed first and then test2 printed. Now let's run this again and see what happens. So this time we have test2 printed first and then test1. So what we are basically doing here is we are telling Spring that this bean is dependent on a bean named test2. So this bean has to be created first, because this bean depends on another bean which is named as test2, and we have this bean called test2 present here, right? So Spring would first create test2 and then it would create test1, because test1 can only be created when test2 is present, because test1 is dependent on test2, right? So in this way we can control the order in which the beans are created. And then we have @scope, which is used to specify the scope of a bean, right? So let's just do one thing. On top of this I would say @scope, right? And I would specify singleton, right? And let's remove these. Okay, I'll just keep test1, remove this, and yeah, I'll just remove let's keep this. I'll remove this statement, and I'll try to Hotwire, right? I'll try to Hotwire private student, right? And what I would do is I would also Hotwire the application context, private application context, app context, right? So application context is basically the container which holds the beans, the Spring beans, right? And since we are using Spring Boot, the application context, this Spring Spring application.run initializes our application context and does a lot of stuff behind the scenes which we need not take care of, right? And what I would do is, inside this method, I would say student s1 equals app context dot get bean, and I would say bean name is student, right? And I would need to typecast this to student, right? And I would copy this, I would paste it here, rename this to s2 and do the same thing, and I would print here s1 equals to s2, right? Okay, so we don't need this. I'll just remove this and let's run this. So we have true printed here. That means s1 and s2 are sharing the same object, or they are referring to the same object. This is because we have marked the scope of this bean as singleton, and a singleton bean means that for a particular bean name or for a particular bean ID, there will be only one object that would be attached or associated with that bean ID or that bean name. And whenever we request the application context to return us an object using the same bean name or the bean ID, it would always return the same object, right? And I have a whole video where I talk about the difference between singleton beans in Spring and singleton classes in Java, and I would put the link for that in the description, and if you would like to check that out, please go ahead and check that out. And that is basically how we can create a bean which is scoped as singleton in Spring, right? And if I change this to prototype, let's change this to prototype, right? prototype, prototype, and let's try to run this application again. So this time we have false printed. That means s1 and s2 are no more sharing the same object, and they're referring to different objects, right? Because we have changed the scope of the bean to prototype, and prototype means every time we request the application context to return us or to fetch us an object with a particular bean name or a bean ID, it would always return a new object, right? So there are other scopes as well in Spring, and we can define those using this annotation scope, right? So the next one we have is @profile, and it is used to specify the active profile for which the bean should be created, right? So for various when we are working in a real-time project, then it is very likely, or it is very obvious, that we'll be having different environments for our application to be run on. And when we'll be developing, that would be a development environment. There are other environments such as QA, UAT, BAT, post-prod, and production environment, and there are other different kinds of environments, right? So for different environments, we might need different kinds of configurations, or we might need different kinds of beans, right? So for a particular environment, we might need a particular type of bean, and then for another environment, we might need another kind of bean, right? So with the help of @profile, we can do that as well, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of this, remove the application context, and inside this I would print, say, QA profile loaded, right? And I would change the name of this to QA prof, or say create QA bean, right? And let's have another bean, and let's rename this to create dev bean, right? Create dev bean, and here I would say dev profile loading, right? Now I would annotate this one as another profile, and inside profile I would say QA, and inside this, or on top of this, I would say profile, and I would say dev, right? Now this time when I run the application, what I would do is I would say run configurations, and inside the arguments I would put an argument -d string dot profiles dot active equals dev, right? And let's try to run this and see how it works. So we have only dev profile loaded, we don't have the QA profile loaded, because we are trying to run it with an argument string.profiles.active, which specifies which profile we're trying to run, or which profile we're trying to load, and Spring would know that only the beans that are inside dev profile needs to be loaded, and so it does not load QA profile beans, right? Now what if we changed the value of this query, or the value of this parameter, or this argument, to QA? Let's say instead of dev we have QA here, right? And we say run. So we can see this time QA profile is loaded and dev profile is not loaded this time. So that is how we can control which beans get loaded based on the environments that we are running, right? What we could also do is, let's say we create another Control-C, Control-V. I would rename this to application QA, right? And to application dev, right? And let's say inside I just get rid of application.properties, and all right, let's just rename this to prod, right? And here I would say QA, and for this I would say prod, and for this I would say dev, right? And I would just copy this, and I just get rid of this, Control-D, get rid of this, Control-D, and let's say we have a variable called private string app name, right? And let's say we have an annotation called @value, right? And let's say we are trying to print the name of the application. So let's say application name is plus app name, right? And let's first try to run this on dev. So let's change this to dev and let's try to run this and see how it works. So we have our application running on dev right now, right? Now let's try to run this on QA. So all we need to do is change the active profile to QA and say run. So this time our application is running on QA, right? And again, let's try to run this and run it on prod. So all we need to do is change the active profile to prod and say run. So this time we have our application running on prod. So based on the environment, we can load different kinds of or different properties files based on the environments, right? And we need not write a single line of code for that. All we need to do is create different properties files for the various environments that we have, and while running the application, just pass the value of the profile that we're trying to run with the help of string.active.profile state, right? And that is how we can load properties files based on environments. So that brings us to the end of this chapter, and in the next chapter we're going to see how Spring MVC works, and we're going to create some applications which exposes our application as a URL that can be consumed, and we are also going to see how we can connect to a front end using Spring MVC module. So stay tuned for chapter 7, and thanks for watching.